All right, everyone. While we do know that some people are continuing to enter the call, many are coming in right away. We will begin. Go ahead and start the webinar. My name is Sharon Roberson. I'm president and CEO of the YWCA Nashville and Middle Tennessee. This is the May webinar in our series of Stand Against Injustice webinar. We have these on a monthly basis. And we always say we have these because there are topics that we would love to educate the public about. And these are important topics to hopefully have a constructive dialogue in our community on issues of importance to the broad community. And we always say that we do this to really invite people to the conversation in a meaningful fashion, not to indict, because we know people have differences of opinion, but we want you to know some factual information and some things that make it very, very important for us to have the best community that we can have. So good afternoon. Today's topic is in pursuit of justice, why due process matters for all. To start off, I think it's important for today's conversation because we will explore questions regarding this issue and more. We will discuss how due process affects our daily lives, from immigration and criminal justice to civil rights, and how communities, advocates, and legal professionals can work together to protect these essential rights for everyone. We have an incredible panel, and we're very fortunate, and I'm thankful that they can speak to you. And we have Charles Grant, a shareholder at Baker Donelson and a veteran litigator. The Honorable Ana Escobar, judge for Davidson County General Sessions Court, Division III, and Emily Stotts, senior staff attorney with the Tennessee Justice for Our Neighbors. And we want to take a moment to thank those sponsors for these webinars, the Nissan Foundation, Alliance Bernstein, and the Harnish Foundation. These are organizations that have stuck with us and do believe that we are making our community better through these conversations. Before I get started, I wanted to make a basic statement. The mission of the YWCA is eliminating racism, empowering women, promoting peace, justice, freedom, and dignity for all. Oftentimes, with the first two parts of our mission statement, people forget that we are advocates for peace, justice, freedom, and dignity for all. And this conversation is in more light of the last part of our mission statement, because due process is a fundamental principle under the United States Constitution. It ensures fairness, justice, and protection of individual rights against arbitrary governmental actions. And we're going to get into the history of the due process clause because it's very, very important, because this is a safeguard to uphold the rule of law and limit abuse of power in our communities. So we'll get started. I'll start off by asking each of the panelists to briefly introduce themselves, and also how the concept of due process is foundational to their work. I'll start with you, Mr. Grant.
Yes, good afternoon. Charles Grant with Baker Donelson in the Nashville office. Obviously, as a lawyer, due process implicates nearly all of my work, especially as a trial lawyer, a litigator. All of my work, both work as it relates to civil cases, the work that I've done in the past, court-appointed cases and criminal cases, due process is at its core. At a minimum, it's about minimum notice and an opportunity to be heard, to defend oneself. It implicates just about everything I do, quite frankly, as a lawyer.
All right, Ms. Sloss, the same question. Introduce yourself and how this concept is foundational to the work that you do.
So good afternoon. My name is Emily Stotts. I'm the legal director at Tennessee Justice for Our Neighbors, which is a nonprofit immigration law firm. So my practice focuses on representing individuals in their immigration proceedings, including applications for humanitarian relief, but also defending people against being deported from the United States. Due process is the same regardless of your immigration status. And so it's also very central to the work I do, just like Charles was saying. All of my cases, due process is implicated. And, right now we're kind of in a climate where more than ever it's being, there's really a need to focus on due process rights and ensure that those due process rights are afforded to our non-citizen community members.
Judge Escobar.
Good morning, and thank you for having me. My name is Ana Escobar. I'm a general sessions judge in Davidson County. 9 months out of the year, I preside over cases dealing with domestic violence. And I also preside over a human trafficking treatment court for survivors who are just as involved. Due process is my daily bread and butter. I believe that due process builds public trust in the legal system. When people feel that they've been treated fairly and they've been heard, they're more likely to respect a court's ruling. This not only benefits that specific litigant, but I believe it helps society as a whole, that we all follow the rule of law and no one is above the law.
Thank you. Now, we do hear a lot, we heard the word due process, and because I've been acutely aware that some do not understand this concept and do not understand who and why it applies to and how did we get here. I'm going to ask you, Mr. Grant Charles, can you provide us with the history of due process? A brief history of due process, that is.
Absolutely, a brief history, yes.
Brief history.
You know, as we,
I
yes,
know I'm working.
Yeah, as we've said, it refers to the, minimum requirement of fair procedures when it comes to certain actions of the government against persons. The Constitution provides that persons shall not be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of the law. And the requirement of due process has been with us in the Constitution from the very beginning through the Fifth Amendment, going all the way back to ratification in June of 1788. But even before then, due process has been a part of the Western legal tradition through the English, going back several hundred years before that. The other part of due process that appears in the Constitution is in the 14th Amendment, and it applies against the states. The Fifth Amendment applies against the federal government. The 14th Amendment applies against the states. So again, it's very fundamental to what we are as a constitutional democracy, as a representative democracy. And it is, very much part of what we are as a free country, to say the least.
Thank you so much. Let's go to you, Judge Escobar, and you handle criminal matters. How does due process apply to criminal cases? You're muted.
Sorry about that. About 10 minutes ago, I was in the middle of due process. As a judge, like I said before, due process means that every individual that comes before me, whether victim or defendant, respondent or petitioner, plaintiff or defendant, is given a fair and impartial opportunity, a level playing field to present their case to a judge that's unbiased and to a jury that's unbiased. So every individual should have the opportunity in a criminal case to have a lawyer. They have the right to be notified of the charges they're facing. They have the right to present evidence in their defense. And they have the right to cross-examine witnesses against them. So, like I said, I practice it every single day. If somebody pleads guilty, I go through this whole list of rights just to ensure that they understand that those are the rights they're giving up when they plead guilty. And when we have hearings, I ensure that both sides have equal time to present their argument.
Ms. Slotts, Emily, we've heard a lot about the concept of due process in the immigration area. How does due process relate to immigration? Because you might think, well, these aren't citizens, these are alleged bad people. Why would they get the right to due process?
So I think I stated earlier that everyone in the United States has the same due process rights, regardless of their immigration status, and that is well-settled law. And that means at the most basic level that they're entitled to notice and an opportunity to be heard. That's true if they're accused of a criminal matter and they're, before Judge Escobar. That is true if they are accused of being in the United States without authorization and are facing repercussions for that. So in the immigration context, what due process looks like is that, everyone is entitled to certain safeguards regardless of immigration status. What safeguards exist can depend on several factors when it comes to someone's immigration status. But typically what that means is that everyone, regardless of your immigration status, has the right to have your case heard, typically by an immigration judge, before you are actually sent out of the United States. And so there are safeguards in place for everybody before they're actually put on a plane or physically removed from the United States. One distinction, though, is that within the immigration context, immigration is a civil proceeding. It's not a criminal proceeding, even though I think once you're in it, it looks very similar. People are detained often like they are in the criminal context. It's the government government trying to prosecute the non-citizen and say that they have to be taken out of the United States. But since it's a civil proceeding, one key difference is that your non-citizens are not provided a lawyer if they can't afford one. They have the right to a lawyer. They have the right to an interpreter in their best language. They have a right to an impartial judge. They have a right to present and examine evidence against them. They do not have a right to a lawyer. And so that is one very key difference. There are also certain situations, depending on their immigration status, if they're actually allowed to see a judge at all. But even if they're not allowed to see a judge, there is typically some mechanism to prevent someone from being erroneously removed from the United States.
All right, we received a pretty important question before I go to the next question I have planned in the chat, and I would say that anyone can respond to this. The distinction between procedural due process and substantive due process. Anyone willing to go wade into that water? Charles, would you like to start?
Well, the concept of procedural due process, we've already been talking about. It's about fair procedures.
Yes.
It's about minimum notice, opportunity to be heard, and so on and so forth. A substantive due process questions whether the government is empowered to take the actions that it takes against an individual. So whether the government or the law that is relied upon by the government, whether that power is appropriate to assert certain actions against people, it can get very, very involved, right? And I would, in fairness to our listeners, the question comes from a very seasoned lawyer who probably already knows.
I know. I said, who came up with that?
She's a very seasoned lawyer who probably knows the distinction, but it can get very, very involved and tedious to talk about it. So in some quarters, even the whole notion of substantive due process is I think it's settled in most instances, but it can be controversial. It's, so it's something that we can't spend a whole lot of time because it'll take the rest of the hour. And I think
Oh yes, oh yes,
yeah.
oh yes, oh yes. All right, anyone else comment on that at all? All right, let's move forward. I'll go back to you, Ms. Stotts. We have seen, as you mentioned before, you work in the area of immigration law, and we all know about marginalized communities, and due process seems to be evolving on a daily basis. How have you seen it evolve in most recent years such that there could be a disproportionate impact on marginalized communities?
So I think it's important to note that the due process rights themselves haven't changed. Everyone still has the same due process rights. The law has not changed. The Constitution has not changed. What we're seeing and what we see in the immigration context often is law enforcement not necessarily willing or more willing to erode those due process rights. They're often willing to ignore it because it's faster, it's easier. And frankly, the target population in the immigration context usually isn't aware of their rights. they don't know their rights, they're unable to assert those rights, they're unable to perhaps afford a lawyer to help them fight, a violation of those rights. And so, it's the enforcement, it's the officers, it's the violations that maybe we see an increase of. Right now, I think it's shifted a little bit in that we're seeing not only an increase in law enforcement perhaps committing due process violations, we're seeing people pretty high up in the federal government questioning whether or not non-citizens really do have or should have the same due process rights. So one example would be individuals who are very quickly designated or allegedly members of certain gang and being swiftly taken out of the United States and actually imprisoned in another country. That's really unprecedented. And, you see that, and you see other instances where what I think we're headed to is really a very, important question that's probably going to head to the Supreme Court about whether or not really and truly non-citizens have the same due process rights.
Okay, well, Charles Grant, it seems like this can get into a slippery slope type situation. Once you erode rights for one, it could erode rights for others. How do we hold systems accountable when due process is denied? What can we do as citizens? And I know you're on the forefront of a lot of cases that are working in the civil rights area. How do we hold systems accountable? How do we make sure the slippery slope of this is a bad actor, they aren't getting due process, and next thing you know, you can be designated a bad actor and you would not receive due process?
Oh, wow. So a lot of it is political. We just have to acknowledge that. It really does begin by, recognizing that, we have a system in place of tradition, of norms, of laws. We have, the trilateral form of government with the legislature, the executive, and judicial. Each of traditionally, legally, have always been recognized to have certain roles. The judicial is responsible for obviously determining what constitutional law is and when and where it's enforced or not. And that role has to be observed and respected. The executive executes the laws, the legislature creates the laws. And so candidly, it starts from making sure that we have the right people in place that recognizes our constitutional order, our traditions, our history. Emily was talking about the due process for everybody. Everyone's entitled to minimum levels of due process. The Constitution says you're entitled to due process of law as it relates to, the government's actions against you with respect to taking your life, liberty, or property. Minimum due process of law. It doesn't tease out, at least in the Constitution, what persons are protected by due process. I think there's a long series of cases to recognize that. Recently, in a case that's being referenced of a person who was in the country legally, had a court order in place not to be removed, and was removed and sent to prison in El Salvador. And the case went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ordered that the person be brought back. Well, then, if that order is ignored, right, where do we go from there? It kind of harkens back to a famous, I shouldn't call it famous, it's probably more, probably should say infamous event about the Trail of Tears, about the forced removal of the Cherokee from the southeastern states by General Andrew Jackson. And even then, the Supreme Court said to General Jackson, what you're doing is illegal, it's improper. You need to stop and reverse your actions. And General Jackson famously responded, well, let's see you enforce your order. It's your order. Let's see you enforce it, right? At the end of the day, those traditions of respecting the rule of law, respecting the orders of the court, what do we do when folks decide not to? And that obviously would lead to constitutional crisis, not wanting to, certainly not trying to overstate or be dramatic about it, but that's the reality of it. You know.
Judge Escobar, something you said earlier in the conversation really struck me because looking in broader terms, individuals, when you're in criminal court, that's a difficult spot. Someone's in a very difficult spot if you are in anyone's criminal court. And you said that oftentimes it makes it more palatable, I guess, to those who may be found, who either the person they think is guilty gets away or the person is found not guilty. Either way you go, there may be someone that feels as though they didn't get a fair shake. But this whole due process, it helps lead to confidence in the system. And I want to make sure that you emphasize that, because how does this going through all these processes and procedures help those who are part of the criminal justice system understand and have more trust, have more public trust, so to speak?
Well, you know, I'm not infallible. And so as part, as I make sure that everyone has a level playing field, somebody loses, right? Somebody's unhappy. And I always say to the losing party, appeal me. And that's really a foundational system that we have. The ability to appeal a judge's decision is critical, because that's how, when statutes and laws are passed that need clarification or may not be constitutional, that's how those things get clarified, is through the appellate system. And so it's a little shocking, frankly, that in current situations that ability to appeal is not happening. Also, I wanted to comment that on CNN on Saturday and this morning, they had a piece about habeas corpus. I don't know if you saw that.
Yeah.
But habeas corpus is kind of the last thing that you can do after you've exhausted all your appeals. You're asking the court to consider your case, and it's specifically for people who are being unlawfully detained or imprisoned. And there is rumor that the administration may do away with it, specifically, I believe, in the context of immigration. And if that last ability to state your case is gone, it's concerning. So it's concerning. It's funny. We all took for granted the ability to appeal, the ability to file a
habeas corpus is real.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah.
And we're reminded that it was through habeas corpus that we've had hundreds of people who have served long sentences in prison who were later determined to be innocent or exonerated in some way. So it was through the writ of habeas corpus that a lot of those proceedings brought to life the evidence that led to exonerations, or at least determinations that the crime was probably not committed by the person who was convicted. So that is again another linchpin, another important keystone in our constitutional order and system of rights, is the writ of habeas corpus. And the thought of saying that can be eliminated is very unsettling.
Let me ask you, this is a little bit off script, but if that is done away with, why isn't that just another hindrance to moving justice quickly? Why do we need that extra step? We've had the trial, we've had these appeals, we've had this. Why would you need that step if we're trying to get bad actors off the street, so to speak?
I just want to interject. In immigration,
Go ahead, Emily.
Yeah, in the immigration context, actually, a lot of times habeas is used sometimes simultaneously as someone's immigration case is going, but often that's the only mechanism people have to get their day in court, to get out of detention. They don't have, it's not like in the criminal context where people might be granted bond or not. There's a lot of situations where habeas is the only manner in which they might have a right to the justice system. So really getting rid of that in the immigration context is extremely concerning, because you're just cutting off any avenue people have to be heard, not just once they've exhausted all other options. That is the remedy.
Any other response? Because this is really an important issue that's part of this whole process that we have to make sure we're mindful of, because I always think we get in this slippery slope context, because you may be favored one day and not a favor another day. And it's important to hold up these concepts so we don't get in a situation where we have individuals who do not have the wherewithal to withstand a system that is not giving them due process, so to speak. And in moments of national crisis or situations where sometimes there's the view that we need to move quickly, we need to move fast. And I think that we have to balance that urgency with fairness. Let's get into that issue. And I'll start with you, Judge Escobar, because it's often complaints about the criminal justice system is too slow, people on death row for so long before they're executed. Why are we taking so long? We need to get this work done. What's your response?
My response is we need more attorneys and more judges, frankly.
Yes, yes.
So, because at least in the domestic violence world, we try to minimize the amount of time that people have to wait on their case, and it benefits the defendant as much as the complaining witness, because everybody needs to know, we have closure and to move on and know what's going to happen. But in other situations, other types of criminal charges, unfortunately, we're looking at 5 to 6 months before you have a court date. And that's simply because we just don't have the manpower to prosecute, to defend, or to judge these individuals. So I would advocate strongly for more judges and more attorneys. And of course, all that takes money.
I see Emily Stotts, you seem to be agreeing with that.
So yeah, in the immigration context, I'm laughing because, first court date in 5 to 6 months, first court date in five years, maybe. Yeah, there are simply not enough judges. There are not enough court staff, even, not just judges, court staff. Let's not forget them. There aren't, and certainly aren't enough lawyers to go around for this. And I think it's also, to combat some of the misleading rhetoric happening about why it takes so long for an immigration case to happen. Well, there's no funding and there's no urgency in getting more judges. In fact, we're seeing a reduction in judges at a time when more people are being put into the deportation pipeline. So I have clients in cases who they desperately want their case heard. They were set for the summer. Now they're going to be in 2027.
Wow. So really what we're talking about is funding can lead to unfairness. The lack of funding can lead to not getting fairness in the system, which is always a difficult thing. Charles Grant, talk a little bit about this fairness and urgency, because everyone wants their case heard, and I've heard so many complaints both on the criminal and civil side. Why does it take so long? Why does it take so long? And a lot of the procedural steps only lawyers can appreciate.
Yeah, as noted on the chat here, justice delayed certainly can be justice denied. I mean, we have a criminal justice system, for example, and Emily made reference to the immigration system, where we simply do not have enough lawyers representing criminal defendants, an overwhelming number of whom require court-appointed counsel. And there is a belief out there that if you get arrested, you're guilty of something. Well, sometimes it's not true. Sometimes, I mean, it is sad, and it's just not true. The overwhelming majority, I would surmise, is probably true, but sometimes there are just people out there who are in the wrong place at the wrong time, but they have not had the benefit of a thorough investigation into the allegations against them. They have not. Oftentimes, they're represented by lawyers who are incredibly overworked in terms of the number of cases they have with the public defender system. We're fortunate, in my view, to have a very strong public defender system here in Metro. I've actually seen some of those lawyers at work. But by and large, around the country and around in other parts of the state and around the country, far too many people are going to court without the benefit of lawyers who are prepared, because the lawyers have, 150 cases, and there are only so many hours in a day in order to prepare for that. So we need to be serious if we want a justice system that works for all. We have to be serious about ensuring that it's properly funded. So that, without overstating the obvious, but if it's to work, we have to provide the support that's necessary for it to work.
If I could jump in, the indigent system to appoint attorneys right now, an attorney earns $50 an hour, which is more than interpreters. I'm sorry, less than interpreters and less than investigators. And so we cannot find attorneys to take these cases. And from my understanding, in the rural areas, it's almost impossible to find attorneys, qualified attorneys. The urgency is so bad that the Administrative Office of the Courts has proposed a new system of just revamping the whole thing. And that should be online within 2 to 3 years. But we are really suffering a crisis of lawyers.
And they don't have a lawyer because they have a right to one, that delays everything. And that's something that we cannot give on, because everyone deserves a right to counsel. And it's very important, even to help you to understand and navigate the system, takes pretty significant expertise. All right, we're at Legal Education, Media, Grassroots Organizing. I see the YW as part of that grassroots effort to help the public understand due process. What do you think the legal community can do to better help, and judicial community, of course, to help the public to understand the concept of due process? Is there anything that the judges are doing, Judge Escobar?
Appearing in fabulous panels like this one. Obviously we need to be out in the community, especially with our young people, explaining to them their rights. Everyone's presumed innocent, the burden is on the state, all that. We need to be out there educating our young people, and just being very public about what is happening in the courthouse.
And also, one of the takeaways, understanding that we do need more lawyers, or need more funding for the lawyers we have. I'm sure if you up that $50 to more, then you might get a few more lawyers on board. But Charles Grant, what do you think about this? What can we do to educate the public?
Every opportunity, talk about it, write about it. I appreciate the YW's leadership in having these forums, but every opportunity, I will almost always say yes if it's in my schedule to talk about how important due process is, and how important voting is, and how important that it is for all of us as citizens to be engaged and to participate in this democracy. It is fragile. We get tired, we get overwhelmed with a lot of negative news, and so we oftentimes are looking for respites from the news cycles, but we have to stay engaged. We have to teach our children. We have to be involved in our communities and our houses of worship, with our neighbors. All of us, we just have to stay engaged. We cannot allow changes to what we believe in our constitutional rights, in our constitutional order to our form of government to be eroded because of apathy. You know, I have friends and family who are talking about moving to some other country because of some changes that they're not happy with. That is the wrong, that is the wrong response. First of all, it's your country. You were born here. You want to, if you believe in it, you have to stay and do something about it. Secondly, what happens here, if you believe it's truly bad, can happen anywhere if it can happen here. So you're not running away from anything. You may be running to something worse, but I'm just saying, we as citizens have to stay engaged and informed and act in a manner that's informed.
I'll go to you, Emily, because we had a question in the chat that I think that you can respond to. I feel very assured of that. We've talked significantly about the issue of our argument that undocumented persons or those without permanent status should not be entitled to due process. You've touched on this, you've discussed it, but we received a question, and can you reemphasize, is there a legitimate argument that they should not be entitled to due process?
You're probably asking the wrong person actually to give you the counter argument here. I feel pretty strong.
Charles, we'll do
way.
Counterpoint.
I think, I think we alluded to this earlier. Like I said, everyone has the same due process rights in terms of there have to be certain safeguards. It's what safeguards are there that are different. So potentially, and there has been some case law about what safeguards are allowed when, depending on your immigration status, depending on where you're encountered by immigration, et cetera. However, I think that is kind of one area. I think what we're seeing on the ground, though, is going after it in a much more aggressive way. It's not looking to take away their people's due process a little bit. It's looking to take it away a lot. When you when you just very brazenly detain someone, accuse them without any basis of being, a terrorist or a gang member, and then imprison them in another country, that is incredibly concerning. That's not a little erosion of a due process right. That's pretty intense. So I'm not sure, sometimes what I hear is I think part of the rhetoric is playing on people's concern that they don't want bad people here. It's almost like they're, trying to create a vibe for people to be okay with the erosion of due process rights. Back to safeguarding that, though, there's nothing in the law that distinguishes, them doing this to someone, to, Kilmar, who has court order to be here and sent to El Salvador. There's nothing that distinguishes that person from a citizen. If you're detained and deported without the ability to even assert that you are a citizen or assert that you have a court order here, there's nothing to prevent that from happening to anybody else.
But what would happen if you did have, let's say, a total bad actor, a gang bang, murdering, rapist person? Why should that person get due process?
Well, how do you know that person's a bad person until they have their hearing?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's the step that I always tell people. How do you know? Because just taking the word of someone without proof is a very, very dangerous. That's why I get into slippery slope. That's why we have wonderful judges like Judge Escobar, because you have to show proof to someone that is trained to determine whether or not the proof is adequate before you take away someone's liberty. That's simply put, that's what you have to do. Anyone else to add to that conversation? All right. Now, we always like to leave with a little bit of hope, because we all have hope and we all love the United States and we love the beautiful system that we have, even when it is not being used in the proper way. But if you had a magic wand and you could change or strengthen one area of how due process is applied in the current system, what would you do and why? I'll go to you, Judge Escobar. You're on the front lines.
I would once again say more judges and more attorneys so we can get people their day in court much faster. And another thing, I'm so glad y'all invited me to do this today, because due process is so ingrained and innate, and I literally take it for granted that not until you invited me to this panel did I slow down and realize that this is something that we all need to pay attention to. After we get over the shock of things, we really need to pay attention to the things that are happening. So we need to stop and protect the due process rights that we all have.
Charles.
Well, we talked about due process as it relates to immigrants, and but it is a slippery slope that we need to be alert to. If you can, I mean, there's the expression that at first they came for the immigrants, right? That was that poetry about how we're not being careful about how we are treating people legally. But I mean, we have children who were born here, who under the 14th Amendment are American citizens, who are being deported without due process, without the minimum requirements of notice and a hearing, just swept up. And again, these are American citizens. If it can happen to them, why not? Why can't it happen to any of us? So it is a slippery slope. Somebody has decided that, okay, even though the 14th Amendment says they're American citizens, because they are children of immigrants who may be here legally or not, we don't agree with that. It doesn't quite work, shouldn't work that way. But if it can happen to those children who are citizens, why can't it happen to any of us?
Emily.
Very similar to what Charles is saying. I think one thing that's really struck me in the last several months is, I've been practicing immigration law for 11 years now. And a lot of my work has been representing asylum seekers. So people who are fleeing different situations in their home countries, but a lot of them have been political asylum seekers. And it's striking to have listened to people's stories about how they love their country, things were great, and then slowly things started to change, but it was changing for other people, not them. But at a certain point, it changed for them, and they were looking at potentially being jailed for having, a minor offhand comment critical of the government. And they had to uproot their family and completely leave everything and flee. And it strikes me that we're really in a moment here where it's a very similar, it's like I can really relate to them a lot more than I could before. So when we say it's a slippery slope, I know people use that term a lot. It really is. And it's subtle. It's not loud. It's it's subtle. And so I think we're at a bit of a disadvantage in that we maybe assume our systems will work because they've worked for as long as they have, and that doesn't happen here. We have to be vigilant. We have to, our system, our justice system, our democracy is only as strong as we allow it to be. And I think that is what I wish would change. It's not that I think the rights aren't there. It is our awareness and our appreciation of them that I wish as a community we would strengthen.
And these conversations are very, very helpful, and it is helpful to learn from other countries and people who have been through this. And some people have been bringing up that point. Look, this is not the first time individuals have seen this kind of behavior that led to disaster, and so we have to be vigilant. We've had some comments in the chat about people feeling helpless and they don't know what to do, and it's depressing and things of that nature. But how do we stay strong? Because that was supposed to be the question where everyone got hope, but I don't know, we kind of dug deeper. Maybe it's just such a thing, we can't come out of this hole, but what can we do? Because I do really have a lot of confidence, and I guess it's because I really do believe that, well, from a spiritual perspective, I just cannot believe that hate can win over time. And I know that sounds very naive, but I really do believe that we do have a lot of faith, that we do have a lot of very important people and strong people that ultimately will bring us out of a situation that could be negative. And I cannot believe that we as a society will stand by and allow for due process as a fundamental foundational element of the United States system to just fall apart. But what can we do for those who feel helpless and feel as though this is a train that they just want to give up? And I understand, I saw that I understand from this, Charles touched on this, but they would like for Charles to elaborate, for anyone else to elaborate on that issue of the helplessness that individuals feel.
The fact that you're here helps, right? The fact that you're trying to be educated about, the fundamentals of your constitutional rights helps, because you can then share that with others within your orbit. And we all have people within our spheres of influence, all of us, households, neighbors, co-workers, although probably have to be a little bit careful about it in the workplace, perhaps. But, people in our houses of worship, we all have people who are within our spheres of influence, and the dialogue can take place as long as we're all respectful. But the dialogue can take place. We need to get back to the understanding of the basic facts of what constitutional rights are. And it's not, it's not some vague notion of what they are. There are certain basic rights that are well settled over the last 2+ centuries in the law, such as due process in a host of different settings that are well settled. And we have to make sure that those rights, the judges issue orders, the weight of the nation's voice can be heard. It should not be a question as to, what happens when the United States Supreme Court's order is ignored. This isn't the 18 teens and General Jackson. This is 2025. That should not be a question. Heretofore, it's not been an issue. It's certainly not in the last 100, since the Trail of Tears case. So we need to recognize that not following orders of the courts, it's not acceptable. And in fact, I think it's an abdication of leadership. If you somehow can support the notion that court orders should be ignored, you should not be a leader. People need to understand that. That's how our system works. And if we can't stand up for it, it actually does begin to crumble. That's the way it's worked. Not perfectly. We all know that. But predominantly, it's been working pretty good for the most part. We've messed up. We've tried to have systems in place to address that. But we have to stand up. We have to understand what our constitutional rights are. We have to understand. I don't know if they teach civics anymore. I wonder about it. First, they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionist, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. And then they came for the undocumented, and I did not speak out because I was not undocumented. Then they came for me. That's as true today as it was whenever, the poem by Martin Niemöller penned it. It's true today. That was a warning then, and it's a warning now. And we need to acknowledge that. We need to wake up to that. And apathy is not an option.
Anything, there's another question, and we love to get our questions, but it says, are judges able to promulgate rules and civil procedure that would insulate due process? I'm not totally sure of what the question is saying, and I don't know if Judge Escobar, that makes any more sense to you.
Well, the way I would answer it, it's already there. The problem is, I'm really concerned about people just one day saying, I'm not going to follow your order, and what that, I mean, right now we have a tough time getting people to honor subpoenas, and that's worrisome. So it's, when you're seeing people at a higher level ignoring court orders, it's going to eventually trickle down. So, but the due process is there. So that's how I would answer that question.
And that's one of the greatest concerns, because we've always, those of us who are lawyers, we know that bad cases can make bad laws. And what if something should come out of a very high court that basically gives you the right to ignore a court order, not thinking in terms of we get down to National General Sessions Court and someone says, well, such and such says I don't have to do this. And then, you end up with chaos. And that's one of the greatest fears, is that you'll have some case law at the highest level that comes out that works against you at every level of courts. And that's very, very dangerous. And have any of you seen some of this dangerous language in any of these court hearings? Is there anything that you've seen or heard that really just, I guess, takes your breath away when it comes to this area of due process, other than just totally ignoring a court order? Anything, Charles? All right, well, we're about at our time. However, I would like to give anyone an opportunity to discuss any change or strengthen the area, or anything else that you want to. We'd like to give you this opportunity before we close out and talk about what's the next steps for the YW. Anything you would like to add to this important conversation? All right, well, I would like to thank you. We do have a survey that we have that's available at the end of this. And the reason we have this survey is not because we want to put you to work. It's because we want to make sure that we're covering topics that are meaningful for the community. As I said, this was an issue that I thought was so important to bring to our audiences, because I do believe without this whole due process that's part of our judicial system, that individuals will have no assurance that their rights will be respected. And I do love that we have individuals such as the ones on this call that are out there on the front line, making sure that our system works for those that it's supposed to protect. Love what you said, Judge Escobar. Love that individuals at least have to believe that if they go through this process, they've been given the opportunity to be protected. I love what everyone has said about working toward having this whole history and laws that we have upheld in the court system. And of course, love Emily Stotts, love what you're doing on the front lines of helping those who really are very needy. And in that civil context is even probably more significant. Well, I guess in the criminal, you could take away their liberty, but at least you do have the right to a lawyer. But when you don't have the right to a lawyer, that gets very tricky and very difficult, because everyone should have a Charles Grant out there fighting for them. Because I hope I do. If I ever go down, hopefully I won't, but hopefully I will have someone of that stature that's there fighting for my rights. So I thank you so much to all the attendees. Please take the time to give us your feedback for these. And thank you very much for these panelists who have provided such significant information and insight into the community. If anyone has a topic they would like for us to tackle, let us know. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. Thank you to the YW for all you do.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.